Hello, I would like to welcome all of you behind your screens on behalf of the organizers of the Estuarial Political Forum. But I cannot start without thanking Professor João Carlos Espada and Professor Rita Sebrae-Brito for their incredible capacity to have kept the Estuarial Political Forum going in the circumstances. Once more, I am astounded by the ability of the team of the Estuarial Political Forum and the whole team at the Political Institute to come up with solutions in the face of adversity. Even if, as a digital Luddite, I have been able to be guided and helped by the team to make this possible, like the rest of our team, I think, I really wish to thank them all on our behalf and just say a big bravo. Today, for this Dahrendorf Memorial Lecture, the subject is very prescient, and it is it tomorrow yet? Reflections on the role of the pandemic in Europe. As we're in the middle of it, I am convinced that this panel will be asked many questions, and that along with our chair, Mark Plattner, we will moderate through the screen. I would just like to add another word, is that for those who are interested in the same subject, in fact, on the 20th, on Wednesday in the evening, you've got a same panel by the Luigi Einaudi Memorial Lecture on the West today and the strategies and threats in the post-COVID-19 era at 6:30 in the evening. So this is a sort of sequel to this panel. But without further ado, I would like to pass the microphone, which is not the case, but the Zoom to Mark Plattner.
Thank you, Catherine. It's a delight to see you again, if only virtually. And also let me thank you for expressing what I think all of the participants feel toward the Institute and its staff, and what a wonderful job they've done of putting this together. Let me say it's a great pleasure for me to chair the annual Ralph Dahrendorf Memorial Lecture and to have a new opportunity to introduce Ivan Kravetsev. I first encountered Ivan in 1998 at a conference in Warsaw that included among its speakers Bronislaw Goremek, Samuel Huntington, Leszek Balcerowicz, Robert Cooper, and Zbigniew Brzezinski. And I remember at that conference, a young and then unknown participant sitting in the back of the auditorium asked some questions that were especially penetrating. I later found out that his name was Ivan Kravetsev. And over the subsequent years, Ivan and I became good friends. Beginning in 2002, he wrote more than a dozen articles for the Journal of Democracy, the publication I edit. And in 2005, I invited him to join the journal's editorial board. He wrote about an impressive range of subjects, ranging from Russia to the EU, to anti-Americanism, to the disenchantment with liberal democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, to the new authoritarianism. And to all of these subjects, he brought an originality and a freshness of perspective unmatched by other analysts. Gradually, others came to recognize Ivan's talent. He was invited to write for many leading publications, including the New York Times, for which he's now a regular columnist. And he's received a host of prestigious awards and positions. He remains chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in his native Sofia, Bulgaria, which I believe has been since the 1990s. And also he's a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Recently, he held the Kissinger Chair in Foreign Policy and International Relations at the Kluge Center of the U.S. Library of Congress. And he's a member of the Board of Trustees of both the European Council on Foreign Relations and the International Crisis Group. Ivan's the author of a number of important books, including After Europe and The Light That Failed, Why the West is Losing the Fight for Democracy, co-authored with Stephen Holmes, which was awarded the 30th annual Lionel Gelber Prize for the year's best book in foreign affairs. He also received the Jean Amery Prize for European Essay Writing. I understand that Ivan's latest book, which is entitled Is It Tomorrow Yet? Paradoxes of the Pandemic, will be published later this month. And I assume we'll get a preview of this book in Ivan's lecture today, which bears the same initial title as the book, but is subtitled Reflections on the Role of the Pandemic in Europe, recalling, of course, one of Lord Dahrendorf's most prominent works, Reflections on the Revolution in Europe. Is Ivan suggesting that the historical significance of the pandemic will rival that of 1989? Well, we'll have to wait to find out. I hope we will also learn the meaning of the phrase, is it tomorrow yet? Which I fear may turn out to be a cultural reference well known to the younger members of our audience, but which is mysterious to me. Ivan will speak for approximately 20 minutes, and then we shall hear from two impressive discussants, both of whom are no strangers to the Estoril Political Forum. Amichai Magen is a senior lecturer and head of the MA program in Diplomacy and Conflict Studies at the Lauder School of the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, Israel. His writing and research address such issues as sovereignty, democracy, governance, political violence, and the foreign policies of Israel and the European Union. Gia Nodia is professor of politics and director of the International School of Caucasus Studies at the Ilia State University in Tbilisi, Georgia, where he also heads the Caucasus Institute for Democracy, Development, and Peace, an independent think tank. He also served for a brief period in the Georgian government as Minister for Education and Science. He's written extensively on nationalism and post-communism, and he's a longtime member of the Journal of Democracy's editorial board. Ivan, who is Bulgarian, is fond of introducing himself, especially to American audiences, as someone who comes from a small country far away. It may be worth noting that both of our discussants also come from small countries that are even further from the center of Europe than is Bulgaria. But despite their geography, these two lands on the periphery of Europe consider themselves as firmly belonging to Western culture and civilization. Amichai and Gia will each speak for no more than 15 minutes, and that should leave us with another 15 minutes for questions and discussion. Now I turn the floor over to Ivan.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Katrina, and it's a real pleasure to be even on Zoom. And when I saw it's a Dahrendorf Memorial Lecture, I tried to imagine Dahrendorf giving a Zoom lecture. I'm not sure he was going to like it because for him, physical presence was so important. But of course, some of the questions that have been kind of making him answer in 1989 is some of the questions that we are facing today. Mark said, is this such an important turning point? I don't know, but I know something which is very important, and this is that in 1989, we had the feeling that we know the direction in which the world is going. It could be an illusion, but basically, this was an important illusion. While the problem with the pandemic is that we have the feeling that there is a certain type of a radical change that is coming up. But the sense is that we are going in all directions at the same time. And this is why in this book, for me, was much more trying to reflect on the paradoxical nature of the changes that we're seeing. I don't believe that we can really claim, at least at this moment, that we know what kind of a change is going to be. And speaking, being kind of virtually in Portugal, I'm going to refer to a Portugal writer that I have been using a lot in my writing, and this is José Saramago, because he wrote a novel called Blindness. And Blindness was a very kind of an important novel about plague. people being infected, losing their sight, and how the government have been reacting. And this is one of the classical parables of society turning authoritarian, basically the loss of freedom. And quite often, the plagues, Camus did the same, have been used as a metaphor for basically losing freedom. But what was interesting in the blindness case is that while others was trying and asked the question how the pandemic is changing our societies, paradoxically, the message of Saramago's novel was, it was not that pandemic changed our societies. It is very much that pandemics allow us to see things that have changed before, and we were unable or unwilling to see. And this is going to be my first argument in this lecture, that when we're talking about the effect of COVID, and I'm talking about particularly European politics, and I'm not interested, to be honest, and knowledgeable about the medical part of it. It is quite important to see what the pandemic is changing, or to what extent we're talking about amplification for certain trends that have been there before. As you know, in medical terms, everybody is saying that pandemic is particularly dangerous for people with the pre-existing conditions. I do believe this is true also in political science. And this is basically where some of the threat comes from. And one of the interesting things for me, basically, working on this short book on the politics of the pandemic, was to go back to history and to realize how transformative historically the epidemics have been in making the modern societies. You're talking, of course, about the Black Death of the Middle Ages, and we're talking about the Spanish flu. But what the historians are telling us is that while this type of pandemics have been very important, they were not remembered. And if you go in the terms of numbers, almost 2 or 3 times more people had died because of the Spanish flu than because of the World War I. But there are only 400 books written about the Spanish flu, and there are 80,000 about the World War I. And one of the problems with the pandemics is that there is no narrative. There is no hierarchical narrative. In a certain way, you're dying, but it's kind of arbitrary, without meaning. When you're dying in a war, the nation state is going to tell you that you sacrifice your life for the nation. When you're basically dying in epidemics, there is pure death. And I'm saying this because I'm not one of those who believes that we're going to remember very well what was happened in this 1 year or 2 years. We don't know when all this is going to be over. But at the same time, I do believe that there are going to be an important transformative changes coming out of it, and not because of the changes that we wanted to do, but exactly because of the fact that certain type of trends that have been present before have been very much strengthened by this pandemic. And my second point is I'll try to discuss the political effect of the COVID-19 in Europe, very much as the second coming of the 3 previous crises that shattered the European Union in the 21st century. The war on terror, the global financial crisis, and the refugee crisis, and trying to see how all this basically pushed these 3 crises to be perceived in a different ways, and also forced Europeans to revisit some of the responses that they came to this crisis. When the pandemic came and when the state of emergency had been introduced in most of the European member states, there was very important European philosophers and intellectuals who immediately said, this is the moment when the governments are trying to capture. You're basically, they're using this state of emergency because they're trying to normalize it. And we are back at the story which we had with the anti-terrorist legislation and the war on terror. And my argument is that this is not how the majority of the people perceive it. While there was a lot of kind of a suspicion towards the restriction on rights coming from the anti-terrorist legislation in Europe, in the West European countries in which there was a anti-terrorist legislation, places like France and Spain and the United Kingdom, in which there have been major terrorist attacks. If you're going to the opinion polls now, you're going to see the tolerance for surveillance and for restriction of rights was much more popular. And one of the important stories that, particularly when it comes to surveillance and these virus tracking apps, people are not simply afraid that they can be infected. They were very much afraid that they can infect somebody else. And this is why kind of this public health crisis make it much more easier for the governments to convince the people that this type of surveillance-based policies are going to be acceptable. If you go to the global financial crisis, then you're also going to be surprised that the same major political leaders in Europe that have decided that after the global financial crisis, they should be much more sticking to the rules, austerity, trying to keep kind of the fiscal responsibility and not to allow mutualization of the debts in the European Union. These very same leaders, starting with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, decided totally to revisit this position. In a certain way, European Union is doing as economic response to this crisis, just the opposite what it did in 2009, 2010, 2011. And there are many things, and I will try to reflect about why I do believe this is happening. But in my view, this is very important to see to what extent all of this crisis, if you listen what people are discussing, as if we're back in time, as if we're back in 2010, or if we're back during the terrorist attacks, which followed also 9/11 in Europe. But in a certain way, all the responses are different. And even if you look at the second coming of the refugee crisis, you're going to be shocked because there are much more borders being closed in Europe as a result of the COVID-19 than as a result of the refugee crisis. Basically, for 2 weeks, all the borders can be resurrected. And there was a lot of talk about the resurgence of nationalism. But my major argument is that this stay-at-home nationalism that we saw during this crisis was very different in its nature than the nationalism that was seen during the migration crisis. Because it was not the classical ethnic nationalism. It was not nationalism based on origin. It was very much nationalism based on residence. Paradoxically, and Portugal is a great example of this, most of the foreigners who happened to be in the European countries when the COVID-19 problem came were treated as if they were citizens. Because you cannot allow to isolate them. You basically cannot allow them to be infected. At the same time, there was this closing of the borders, and many, for example, Bulgarians who happened to be outside of Bulgaria and didn't decide to come back immediately, were not particularly welcome because they were perceived as a society as a threat. They come from outside, they can infect. So I'm saying this because there was a rise of nationalism, but at the same time, this crisis also exposed the economic limits, particularly of the nationalism in the small European nation states. At the moment in which the borders were closed and people were not allowed to leave their apartments, there are special charter flights organized for East European workers to fly to Germany and to Austria in order to harvest asparagus. So paradoxically, suddenly, Europeans understood how much their economy are interconnected, to what extent, for example, Western Europe is depending on East European labor. And I'm saying all this because all these things does not go easily in one direction. One of the major paradoxes that I see, and I spent the first lockdown for 70 days in the Bulgarian countryside, I even had a kind of a guilt because of it, because it was not a particularly bad period for me staying there, reading and writing. But you can see people who have never been interested in the big picture. They have never been interested in the world. Suddenly, when they have been arrested and closed in their apartments, they start to be interested. What is happening? How many people are infected in Brazil? How many people have died in the United States? Suddenly we realize that we're living in this big world and we depend on things which otherwise we're not aware of. So I'm saying this because, and this is the last 2 points I want to deliver. As a result of this kind of understanding of the connectedness, but also the insecurity coming of the fact that we're so much interconnected, there were 2 questions that was always asked. And one is how the competition between the different political systems is going to be affected by the pandemic. So to what extent democracy or authoritarianism is responding better, what we can see about this. And of course, I do believe it's very early to make any kind of a conclusions because we're talking about the pandemic that is not over. So this is basically to discuss who is winning when the war is not over. And we can easily see that certain countries that have been seen as doing very well on the initial stage, not overperforming on the next stage. But in my view, there's three interesting things that at least I have been observing. One is, it is much more the difference between democracies and the difference within the authoritarian regimes that turn to be much more important than the difference between democracies and authoritarianisms. For example, there were democracies that did particularly well. Taiwan did incredibly well. South Korea did well. Denmark did well. And we can try to explain what was this. At the same time, there were democracies that obviously failed. But there are authoritarian regimes that really didn't do well. So paradoxically, jumping and trying to get the conclusions based on the nature of the political regime could be one of the major mistakes that we can do when we are trying to analyze the response, and particularly this early response, because as the researchers have shown, there are three other factors that turn to be more important in this initial response. One is the level of social trust in society. The second is the effectiveness of the state. And this is not simply how big is your public health budget, but how well you're communicating, how basically you can organize. Obviously, some decentralized countries were doing better than some over-centralized, but certainly a previous experience. It's not by accident that the Asian countries did better than, for example, the Europeans, because they have this type of a crisis for the last 20 years twice. And for example, South Korea, even on the legislative level, have been prepared starting with 2012 for what happened now. So trying to generalize on the level of democracy versus authoritarianism, in my view, is kind of a good propaganda work. And I'm sure that China is going to use it because one of the major things that is people going to stay with was the relative success of China, and this is paradoxical, country that brought us the virus, and at the same time, basically, obviously, the failure in the United States. And because this is the two big countries everybody is looking at, I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of talk about democracy versus authoritarianism, but this is two additional points on this that I want to make. One is, there was this kind of a conventional wisdom that authoritarian leaders are particularly benefiting from crises like this because they're masterful about the politics of fear, and for sure, plagues injecting fear in our society. If you look around what is happening in places like Belarus, if you're going also what is happening to Russia, you know that in fact, this is not a crisis that authoritarian leaders particularly like, because I do believe that the most important freedom every authoritarian leaders cherish is the freedom to decide what kind of a crisis he's going to respond to. They like to change the crisis. In a certain way, most of them like the crisis that they have created themselves. Secondly, this crisis created this frame of comparisons in which you all the time, your response is compared to what is happening in other countries. And normally authoritarian leaders does not like comparisons particularly. They're not famous for kind of passion for comparisons. And the third, which is particularly important, is that this is not an enemy that can be defeated. Nevertheless, that many governments are using the war rhetoric. This is a problem that can be solved, and you want to share power, and particularly with the medical experts. But one of the problems of the authoritarian leaders are that they don't know how to share power, even with doctors. And this was interesting to see even in the countries in which there was not kind of a major failure, but President Putin, which was otherwise extremely kind of decisive in responding to other previous crises, he was totally absent in this crisis. If it was not for the mayor of Moscow, basically, I do believe that Russia was going to have even more devastating effects. So I'm saying this because it is quite important to understand that from time to time we're becoming the victims of certain type of our own assumptions that were not very much tested. And the same was with the fear that the populist parties are going to be the biggest beneficiary politically of this crisis. This also didn't turn true. You see the results of the last elections in, for example, Vienna, where basically the far right was just destroyed. In Italy, Salvini didn't manage to achieve what he has been looking for. And honestly speaking, even President Duda, that he'd been re-elected in Poland, he did it in a much more difficult way than anybody expected. Just 3 months ago, Everybody believes that the re-election of Duda is going to be like a walk in the park. It didn't turn to be like this. I'm saying this because, and this is an argument which I'm sure that can be criticized, but my major argument is that psychologically, populism is not rooted in fear, but in anxiety. And anxiety is different than fear. This is a fear of a diffuse nature. You fear that the world is going wrong. You believe that kind of nothing is in the way it should be, and you're looking for somebody to represent your sense of disappointment and anger. But when a real fear appears, when you basically really fear being infected, dying, ending in a full hospital in which probably there is not bed for you, then you're not looking for somebody to express and represent your sentiments. You want somebody to solve the problem. You need a protection. And from this point of view, effectiveness of the leadership is becoming critically important. I want to end just very briefly because I know that the geopolitical dimension of this is also going to be something that we're going to discuss. And I just want to make three very simple points. Because exactly because this crisis was also kind of strengthening some of the major trends that we see before it. This was a paradoxical crisis. If 2 years ago, we're going to discuss what kind of crisis can give best incentives to the governments to cooperate, we probably should have agreed that this is a pandemic like this. This is not a war. This is much more urgent than climate change. This is not a great migration. Suddenly, you saw that the level of international cooperation was almost zero. You see at the one and the same time, a push for fragmentation, clearly seen also in certain economic developments recently. And on the other, the increased political and geopolitical polarization between the United States and China. It was not created by the COVID-19, it was there before. But I do believe this was strengthened, and I don't believe it is going to be reversed regardless of the fact who is going to be elected president of the United States. So my argument is that in this situation of fragmentation and polarization at the same time, particularly with a very important stress on the role of the technology in this geopolitical polarization, what we can expect in the short term is the overactivism of the middle powers. Countries who basically feel totally destabilized because of the emerging new disorder, and at the same time, they don't feel constrained as they have been before. So what we're seeing by Turkish activities in place like Nagorno-Karabakh, what you're seeing Russia, which I do believe is going to use the next 2 or 3 months to try to fix his position in Belarus and probably be active in Ukraine. This type of idea of the regional power to try to basically consolidate their own spheres of influence, very much relying to the fact, what by the way, the Chinese did in Hong Kong when everybody was busy with the China's virus, basically they decided to consolidate this power. I do believe this is going to be a new reality. And in this new reality, and this is my very last point, European Union found itself in a strange position. According to the opinion poll that European Council on Foreign Relations did, the big majority of Europeans are disappointed with the way the European Union reacted to the initial stage of the crisis. Some of the countries are quite self-confident about their governments. Germans were like this. Some, like the French and the Italians, were not particularly pleased. But as a result of this disappointment, 70% claimed that we need more European cooperation than before. And the problem is why? And my answer is, Europeans basically felt as the result of this crisis extremely lonely. The United States didn't play the role that usually it plays in this crisis. And many Europeans, according to the poll, were really shocked by the dysfunctionality of the system. China came to be much more aggressive than some Europeans were telling themselves that it is. And suddenly, European Union became the default options, both for the nationalists and for pro-Europeans. But this time, it's a European Union which is much more trying to protect Europe from globalization than European Union that basically is going to integrate Europe in the global world. And I do believe from this point of view, COVID-19 really has a transformative power outside of the public health crisis and the economic crisis that it has created. Thank you very much. Mark, I'm not, you are not, you're muted.
Okay. Am I audible now? I want to thank Yvonne for a characteristically fascinating and provocative presentation, and also for keeping very well to the time limits. One thing that we didn't solve my question of where that title comes from.
I'm going to tell you, and unfortunately you're going to be surprised. It's even not coming from a rap song, but I saw this as a title of some exhibition that I saw 15 years ago in Singapore, and it stayed with me, probably because of my bad English. But I had the feeling that it is capturing something. And this is not speaking good English from time to time helps for titles.
Okay, Amakai, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I can listen to Ivan for hours and meditate on his wonderful observations about the world, where we came from, where we are, and where we may be going. Let me thank the Institute for Political Studies and my friends, and my only regret is that we can't meet physically in beautiful Estoril, but we will do so next year and the year after and the year after that. I'm positive of that. Ivan has put on the table so many rich and varied areas for conversation. Let me just touch upon two or three of them, and I'll try to keep my comments short so that we have as much time to hear Gia, of course, and then also to have a discussion. I already see that we have some great questions lined up. One thought that comes to mind from Ivan's observations is the contrast between the correlation between democracies, liberal democracies, Western democracies in particular, and the idea of trust and the idea of competence. I think that if we go back to 1989 or the immediate post-Cold War era, there was a very strong correlation in people's minds, and not just in the West, but I think truly around the world, that there was a strong correlation between liberal democracy and competence and trust. Trust in the information coming out of these societies, trust in the media, in the criticizing, sometimes self-flagellation nature of liberal democracies. And as Ivan has already alluded, that correlation between liberal democracy and competence and trust, I think, has really suffered greatly as a result, not just of the COVID-19 pandemic, but as with many other aspects of our lives, the pandemic has acted as a catalyst or as an accelerant for social, cultural, technological processes, political processes that were already there, but the pandemic has really exposed, I think, the fault lines of our societies, and we are paying a very heavy price. And I think first and foremost, the United States is today paying a very, very heavy price for the loss of trust in the essential competence of the United States to deal with major challenges. And that then brings me to, I think, another critical point that Ivan has made and that we need to really grapple with. I think this is really the key to liberal democratic renewal, and that is the issue of anxiety. As our good friend Alan Kahn has said, and he's now writing a book about this, liberal societies are societies in which people, all people, including minorities, do not have to live in perpetual fear. Liberalism is really about the attempt to provide human conditions of security and well-being that allow us to realize our potential without terror and without fear. And if one thinks about it, the evolution of liberal orders has really been in response to the different things that we have feared in the modern world. Religious fanaticism and civil war in the 17th century. Absolutism, the crushing power of absolutist statehood in the 18th and 19th century. Poverty in the late 19th century and early part of the 20th century. Totalitarianism in the 20th century. So liberal orders are really solution structures that we have devised in order to try to create conditions where we do not have to live in permanent fear and anxiety. And what we need to do going forward is to figure out what are the fundamental drivers of anxiety in our societies. And we have different ideas about this. I know Ivan has written about demographic anxiety, the fear of demographic decline or the fear of displacement, the fear of loss of identity, the fear of loss of attachment, the fear of loss of dignity, or becoming economically redundant or technologically redundant, right? We have different conceptions of what that anxiety is in the second decade of the 21st century. But in essence, when we come to think about the day after, when we come to think about liberal renewal, we want to delve into the deep causes of our collective societal anxiety and begin to generate liberal solutions to that anxiety. My own sense, and I've just started to think about this, I'm talking a little bit off the top of my head, is that if there is a kind of underlying fear, an underlying anxiety that defines our era, it is the fear of human redundancy, of becoming redundant as a normal human being. And that is, I think, the main task before us in the coming years and decades. Building institutions, building processes, building cooperation that will fundamentally alleviate the human fear of redundancy. Redundancy as the result of existential catastrophe, redundancy as the result of automation or unaligned artificial intelligence, redundancy as the result of uncontrolled migration, or as the result of demographic decline. This is the challenge for us. Now, we have our contemporary modern liberal order because historically liberalism has both competed against anti-liberal and illiberal solutions, and because liberalism has proved to be functionally superior to illiberal and anti-liberal alternatives. So religious toleration, adopted by the Dutch and by the English, demonstrated that it produced better outcomes, better military, political, economic outcomes than religious fundamentalism. Republican government demonstrated that it was superior in the long run to absolutist government, and liberal democracy in the 20th century proved that it was a superior system to Soviet and Chinese totalitarianism. That is why we have been successful historically. And my point is that we need to be very, very careful of the complacent and dangerous assumption that our liberal values will somehow triumph regardless of whether we are successful in contesting and defeating illiberal and anti-liberal powers and ideologies in the 21st century. We mustn't make the Marxist mistake of historical determinism. And that means that we now find ourselves at an historical moment where once again, we need to generate superior ideas, number one, superior institutional solutions, and better political functionality, but also we cannot ignore the dimension of power. We must contest and generate better technological, economic, and ultimately military power than our competitors. Now, I know that this is something that Europeans tend to be very uncomfortable with. Europeans are very uncomfortable with the idea of aggressive contestation and especially military power. But if my argument to you would be that if we do not generate superior liberal ideas, superior liberal institutions, and power to back up those ideas and those institutions, we are running the risk of losing. We are running the risk of losing in the big data, in the AI competition, in the synthetic information, in the synthetic biology competition. These competitions are happening. And if we do not muster our resources and generate better ideas, better political functionality, and greater power, which does not have to be militaristic or aggressive power. There's also the power of cooperation, the power of innovation. But if we do not do that, we should not be surprised that we will lose the contestation for a liberal world in the 21st century. Let me just end really very briefly, if I may, Catherine, if I still have a couple more minutes, by suggesting that when we come to think about liberal renewal, we really want to think about 3 baskets of renewal in the day after, going forward. Basket number 1 is the struggle against historical amnesia and revisionism. There are some good old liberal truths that we have forgotten. The value of human dignity, the idea of the sovereign and responsible individual, limited government, accountable government, the rule of law. We have been so confident in the inevitable triumph of these values and institutions. We've done a terrible job conveying the centrality and the importance of these values to younger generations. And we really need to do much more in this regard. If you like, we need a new and assertive and rather radical liberal patriotism that will recapture the language of attachment, the language of belonging and hope in the future. So that's basket number 1. Basket number 2 is to learn from the mistakes of the last 30 years, from our complacency and triumphalism in the post-Cold War era. And there's a tremendous amount of various ideas and debates out there about what that might look like. Essentially, I think we really need to focus on regaining the functionality of our political institutions, because if we don't do that, we will simply be unable to address the fundamental problems that we face. And secondly, we need a leaner and meaner liberal international order that has new forms of cooperation between like-minded countries. The Bretton Woods institutions, the UN, the WTO, all still very useful, but they cannot provide us with the kind of innovation and the kind of solutions that we need for dealing with AI, big data, disinformation, and so on and so forth. We need to be much more assertive and creative in this regard. Last but not least, the third basket of innovation, responding to new challenges. Let me reiterate, liberalism will only survive and thrive in the 21st century if it is able to produce more persuasive and more attractive solutions than those offered by its competitors. I will end by mentioning two areas that I think are especially important for Europe and for the transatlantic community. One is what I would call the really fundamental problem of epistemic insecurity. We are facing, and I just heard a podcast today about a new book called The Information Apocalypse by Nina Schick, I believe. It's a fascinating and terrifying prospect where within 2 or 3 years, we're going to be confronting deep fake of such sophistication that we will simply not be able to know, to have any kind of epistemic security. And every politician will be able to claim that, they didn't say it, they didn't do it, it's all deep fake. This is something that Russia today is using, but increasingly, because of Russia's success of using disinformation and misinformation and undermining our basic epistemic security, other international actors, China, Iran, etc., are emulating this. If we do not address this problem of epistemic security, we are really in very, very deep problem. Last but not least, the issue of
Amikai, we're running late. If you
running out of time, so I will stop there, and maybe we'll pick up some of these themes later on. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you for those very eloquent words. Gita, your turn. Gotta unmute yourself.
As I always do. So I want to greet everybody and thank João Espada and his institute for keeping me in this great, wonderful, stimulating company. Again, even if on Zoom. And I will try to react briefly to great ideas of Ivan's great ideas, as usual, brilliantly presented. I tried to guess what he would be speaking about from the title of his lecture, and about whether tomorrow has already arrived. It was not crystal clear for me, but my guess was that we would somehow be expected to link the issues of democracy and issues of pandemics. And so I thought that maybe I should title my intervention as The Tale of Two Crises. We, at least for last 5 years, for sure, most conferences are about crisis of democracy, those that I attend. Now, Ivan said that anxiety is something typical for populists. I think anxiety has become very typical for democracy scholars and democracy activists. And I think Amikai in his intervention listed quite well, you know, so certain sources of anxiety, and some of them I have never heard about, like epistemic insecurity. But I think it's a wonderful term, yes, and anxiety about humans becoming redundant. It's not only about democracy, of course, but somehow democracy and humans are related topics. So we had this sense of crisis, and this meeting in Estoril was planned as focused on one dimension of this crisis, the threats that coming from rising China. So how rising China is making this situation worse. And now we have this new crisis. It somehow, I wouldn't say overshadows the previous one, but is obviously more urgent in our daily lives. And especially in the spring, we could not really talk about much else but pandemics. So it's a natural natural instinct to somehow try to link these two crises. And I think the wording that Ivan proposed about pre-existing conditions as kind of this linkage is really wonderful, because we had these pre-existing conditions of crisis of democracy and crisis of liberal international order and many other crises, crisis of trust in general, as Amikai, I said, spoke about very eloquently. And now comes COVID, but when it's about COVID, it implies that, okay, we have if pre-existing conditions are bad enough, then we will die. Is it that this COVID will be kind of a final nail in the coffin of democracy or something like that? No, obviously not. No, it's not that Ivan or Amikai meant. So I would prefer to move from this pre-existing or specify, be more specific about pre-existing condition, what this pre-existing condition is. It's about pre-existing fears and pre-existing hopes, I would say. And the COVID somehow, I think, strengthened both our pre-existing fears or pre-existing anxieties, if you wish, and pre-existing hopes. And we want to many people wanted to interpret the changes that pandemics brought as somehow justifying our fears or maybe justifying our hopes. So some people who were more pessimistic tended to be more pessimistic, saw pandemics as strengthening China, for instance, strengthening China further. So then it already was strengthening. So somehow it's looking more confident about itself and about its power, that Russia and China both used these pandemics to show their superiority. You see what's going on in Europe, how helpless they look, how cannot they really take care of this and how good we are. And then, of course, in the United States, things went very badly, and Russia and China tried to use it as some kind of propaganda tool, right? Right, of course they did. But what's the lesson learned from that? What can we say that what happens in the bigger picture of things? I think in the bigger picture, nothing new really happens. I think we are worried about rising China and more aggressive Russia for a long time. And of course, Russia and China would take advantage of this opportunity for their propaganda reasons. But is it so that autocratic countries deal better with pandemics? I think Ivan said very well that it's not the case. So I don't think that pandemics somehow exposed weaknesses of democracy more than it had exposed them. And on the other hand, it did expose sort of disconnectedness within European Union, that each country tried to deal with pandemics on its own and closed borders and even reduced exports and sort of even all those four freedoms which create the essence of European Union were jeopardized in a way. But on the other hand, it also it also created maybe new demand for closer cooperation within European Union. And Ivan also, I don't know whether he writes about it in this book, but he wrote it on some other other texts. which are related to these results of the pandemic. So I wanted to say that overall, I am a little bit maybe less optimistic about transformative power of pandemic than Ivan was. I think for me personally, the best summary of expectations, what will happen after pandemics, was expressed by French writer Michel Houellebecq, that everything will be the same, only the worse. It will be just everything will be worse, but basically the same. I think I'm afraid this will be the result of pandemics for world politics, global politics, or European politics. And maybe it is not without reason that, as Ivan mentioned, only quite few books were written about Spanish flu, but much more books were written about World War I, even though Spanish flu killed more people than World War I did. I don't think that pandemics really, so far at least, has influenced politics in any important way, as probably Spanish flu did not either in its time. But we live with the same problems. We are still, we are in Zoom, yes, but we are still with the same problems. That we have somehow found out in more shocking way, maybe, and depressing way about inherent vulnerabilities of democracy, which are many, unfortunately. And we are in this deep anxiety whether we will be powerful enough and self-confident enough and strong enough to deal with them. And of course, one topic which really resonates with issues of pandemics is trust towards the elites. There are these fears that autocracies will be, there will be more demand for strong state and maybe autocratic state, because in a crisis we need some unifying power, some strong hand which will take care of us. And I think it's justified to some extent. But what it exposed in democratic countries, I think it's a different thing, that it is that sometimes people are even more inclined not to trust elites and not to trust their governments than they were before. And we see also many expressions of that around the world. Although we are not always sure whether it is linked to pandemics or not. For instance, we have these big rallies in Belarus against Lukashenko. And there is temptation to say that it is because Lukashenko had really responsible policies towards pandemics. He really played it down and did not do anything basically about it. And now he got his just desserts, so to say, that people started to protest against him, and he has a real problem. But is it about pandemics? Can we be sure about it? How much it is? The paradox, one of the paradoxes in case of Belarus is that if you look at numbers, numbers about pandemics, Belarus is not doing so badly. Not to justify Lukashenko's irresponsibility, maybe he got maybe luckier than others, but his numbers, Belarus numbers, are not worse than numbers of its neighboring countries, really, when it comes to pandemics. So I think we are sometimes overestimating the influence of pandemics on problems, or these protests in the United States that we saw in the middle of pandemics also. So of course, there is also a temptation to link it to pandemics. People were locked in, locked down, or locked in, whatever, for so long, and it creates some psychological problems, and then it burst out in a way. But is it so? I mean, the problem people that took, because of which people took it to the streets, I mean, racial justice, it has been a big problem, and there have been many such crises in American history. So I don't think we should overdo it about pandemics. But the problem is that we have reasons to be anxious. We have reasons for anxiety about fates of democracy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for those very good comments. Not sure how to proceed now. Ivan, would you like to respond to either of the discussants at this point?
I just want to thank all of you, because it's a real pleasure to be part of this discussion. And I do believe we should open for questions. One thing that I found interesting when I was listening is that the major difference between pandemic and the problems of democracy is that in the pandemics, you know that there is a vaccine. And when the vaccine comes, all the problems should be over. At least the imagination is that you know the end story. With the democracy, basically, there is no vaccine. And even the stories that we're talking about and so on. So I also very much agree with Gia that it is easy to try to explain everything that comes now through the pandemics. I agree with him that this is not probably the explanation, but you have a triggering things. It was there. And talking about Belarus, which I also found quite interesting. I was also surprised by something. I was surprised that, strangely enough, Mr. Lukashenko managed to create a nation. And now this is the nation that basically stood against him and emancipated from him. But he created a nation in a different way than most of the nation building projects took place in the former Soviet space. It was not based just on ethnicity and so on. But for people that have been there, and this is my last point, what pandemics is different than other crises that we talk about is that for 2 months, all of us have been in the same world. The world was incredibly synchronized. Before something is happening on one place and another thing on the other, and then suddenly you have this kind of an idea that the space shrank, everybody's talking about the same thing. My mother observed that changing the TV channels, and you go on the language that you don't have a single word that you know in April, but you know very well what the prime time news is about. Because in every different channel, it was only about the pandemic.
Mark, I mean, I would like to ask to carry on what you've said and what Gia and Ivan said, but the fact that it didn't expose our democracies. However, I've got a question. It did expose the lack of imagination of our Western democracies. I mean, in the sense that basically we were applying sort of Middle Ages lockdowns. And I wanted to know what you felt about the fact that there is very little leeway which was given to a form of social responsibility. And to the extent, what do you think about the perhaps courageous decision of Sweden to go on its own, perhaps at its cost?
Listen, it's a great question, because it was exactly after the Spanish flu in 1921. The famous Chicago economist Frank Knight wrote an important book on the difference between uncertainty and risk. And he said, we all the time are dealing with risks. We're trying to basically calculate the risk and to take a future actions, but there are moments in which you have a total uncertainty. You don't know anything about the nature of the virus. You don't know what to do. And then you're working with the worst case scenario. But secondly, particularly if you're a democratic government, when you don't know what to do what others do. Because at least you're not going to be accused of not doing it. And this is why we ended up with this strange situation in which there was no international cooperation at all, but at the same time, almost everybody was doing the same things. Locking down, nevertheless, that in some countries in Bulgaria, when we locked down, there were less than 100 people being infected per day. And from this point of view, Sweden for me was really admirable, not because I do believe that their policy was right. This is, by the way, very early to know who was right and who was wrong, because it's also what you are maximizing. People that, but also economic impact, but the mental health of society after all this is over. But the self-confidence to act on their own, to be a dissident government in the moment of crisis like this, is even more risky than to be a dissident in a normal authoritarian state, because you cannot expect sympathy from anybody if it goes wrong. So I agree with you that this kind of a dissent was very important, and it talks about the self-confidence, not simply of democratic governments, but of certain democratic societies. You cannot do this if you don't trust that your society is going to understand why you're doing this.
Yes,
I wanted to add to this, if I may. I read Ivan's and Mark Leonard's policy paper on pandemics and European Union opinions. And it was interesting that there were two countries with the highest confidence in their governments, but also in their expert communities. They were Sweden and Denmark. It was quite paradoxical that Sweden and Denmark were pursuing opposite policies, and their experts were continuously arguing with each other which one was right and which one was wrong, but both of them had the highest confidence of their peoples. So it's probably, I also, as Ivan, admire the audacity, if you wish, of the Swedish government in pursuing its own path. But it's very interesting that they had people behind them, that it was fully somehow, they had feelings that it was somehow inclusively, democratically taken course.
Yes, sorry, it's because I wanted to, there are several questions coming which are extremely interesting. And I think it would be fair to actually, for example, there's this question from Thomas Sarmento Caldera, who is a student at the Political Institute, and he's saying, what's the role played by the pandemic in the new democratic uprisings, such as the Thai and Belarusian?
Well, listen, as we said, it's very difficult to decide. This was not the reason. The guy was in power for 26 years. And there is a moment in which repressive, doing what he was doing, and the Belarusian regime is not a simple regime, because in a certain way, he managed also to keep the power and particularly the loyalty of his security services, even in the moment when he was challenged by different places. But the moment comes in which people said, enough is enough. And we don't know what was the role of the pandemics in this, but what is important about all these protests in the time of pandemic is that when we're not talking about these anti-restriction, anti-mask protests, the most important is that in the streets of Belarus, in other places, you have people who fear to be infected, and nevertheless they go in the crowd. And this makes them so important, exactly because one of the first things which democracy is suffering in the moment of the pandemic is the disappearance of the crowd. And in the 1920s, we feared that the crowd is going to be too visible. But now we start to fear that they're not going to be crowd, because from time to time, and in many places, and my own country is one of them, people know that they're living in democracy only when they're on the street and they know that they can go safely back after protesting against the government. This is a major difference between democracies and authoritarian regimes, even when some of those authoritarian regimes are allowing people to vote. So as a result of it, it was critically important because this additional risk taking to protest in the days of pandemic make the protest very powerful political instrument. And what Gia said, for me, this is quite interesting and very positive on this side, on the democratic side. You remember Carl Schmitt made an accusation against the liberal democracies that they're undecisive regimes, that they cannot act in the moment of emergencies. And what was important and what was common between both Sweden and Denmark was that they acted. And they put all the legitimacy of their democratic legitimacy behind the decision that they had taken. So from this point of view, nevertheless, that some people are unhappy about the over-decisiveness of our governments, I do believe that they decided in a certain way to challenge the major Schmittian argument. that democracies in the moment of crisis are confused and they don't know what to do. Probably we're doing the wrong thing, but at least we knew that the only option that you don't have is not to act.
There is, yes, Mark?
No, I was going to pose another of the questions that we had from the floor, which brings us back to the overall subject of the conference. It's from Livia Franco, who teaches at the Institute. Professor Kravetsev, can you elaborate more on China's paradoxical role in the pandemic and the geopolitical consequences of that? After all, it was the place where the virus was born and spread from, but also the country that seemed most willing, quote, to help others, at least in Europe, to cope with the nefarious effects of the pandemic. What do you think the overall consequence has been for how Europeans view China?
No, on this, I'm simply going to refer to the study that we did, because of course it's different from country to country, but China is benefiting from something different. China is benefiting from its economic recovery. For the last 3 months, basically, they have economic growth of 4%. But the China face mask diplomacy backfired. And it backfired exactly because it was too much perceived as a classical power politics. The view of China among the 12 member states of the EU that we surveyed have deteriorated. So China was perceived as more aggressive. And this was particularly strong in Germany because the Chinese are offering help, but at the same time, they were insisting to be praised. They insisting others basically to praise the way they're dealing with this. They were insisting that nobody should criticize the initial stage of the pandemic when they basically covered the information. And Europeans didn't see this kind of a genuine support that is coming out of caring about others. They saw it much more as a power politics. So it didn't work in Europe. How it is working in other countries, and particularly in Africa and places where China is very much present, it's very much more difficult for me to tell you because I don't know the data for there. But there is one interesting thing if you see to the vaccine policies. China is concentrating to create a vaccine that can be very easily distributed in the third world. While most of the Western vaccines are very much basically targeting and are based on basically surveys of the Western societies. So from this point of view, you can see that all these kind of pandemic related policies are very much has a very strong power dimensions, and particularly European publics noticed it.
Yes, there's another question, I mean, by a student, I think, about, hang on, it's, where was it? Yes, by Joao Payne, who is also a student at the Political Institute, and he says, how can democracies be the lighthouse of the world when they seem paralyzed by fear of the pandemic and dependent of a vaccine?
Listen, it's a very good question, because here is also the vaccine paradox. You know that we all talk about the vaccine being the end of the pandemics, but then you go on the opinion polls and you're going to see that almost half of the Americans and 1/3 of the Germans said that they're not going to allow to be vaccinated. So from this point of view, listen, there is something very natural what is interesting about the pandemics, and particularly in the first weeks, we have forgotten about our mortality. The Western, particularly the Western modern individual, is always keeping the death in the next room. We have, unlike kind of the older generations, we didn't know how to sleep in the same room with death. The death basically became unnatural for us. I was talking to a doctor and he was telling me, listen, somebody is dying at 98 years old. And his relatives are telling me what was the reason for him dying. And he said, listen, I don't know the reason, but at some point we're dying. So I'm saying this because this happened and these fears and anxieties are there. What I'm afraid of, and I do believe that questions go in this story, is that democracy very much started basically to try to represent the fears of the people than anything else. no interests, no aspirations, no values. So you have this therapeutic term in the democracy where basically political leaders treat themselves and view themselves as a psychoanalysts than basically any type of a political representatives. And this I see as a major issue.
Okay, Ivan, there are 14 minutes left. Mark, would you like to say something before I conclude?
Just to thank all our panelists for what I thought was a terrific session, especially Ivan.
Absolutely, I would like to thank you all and to thank also for all of you for all those wonderful questions. I'm sorry we were not able to ask all of them. Let me remind you that now there's going to be a short break of 15 minutes. And then the concluding panel is starting at 6:30 Lisbon time, because it's a lot later in Paris. And so it's just the Winston Churchill Memorial Lecture will be on the difficulties mastered, our opportunities won on the UK, Portugal, and Europe in 2020 and beyond. And this is all from all of us here. Thank you very much, Ivan, Gia, Amichai, and Mark. And this is goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.